Hi everyone. I'm back to talk about the Apostle Paul. This particular video is going to be called Paul in Athens, and all women were prostitutes. And I will be adding this video to the playlist called Unraveling the Apostle Paul, which will be on my YouTube page, Judith Carlone Levi Ministries. You can go there at your leisure and take a look at it any time. And I invite you to, if you haven't done so already, to go into that playlist. There are many in this series that I've done, and view anything you haven't viewed so far as to bring you up to speed in where we are right now in discussing the Apostle Paul. I just want to give you a brief overview of what we've discovered so far, okay? All right. We talked about the culture in the ancient world, and specifically in Greece. We talked about the audience that Paul spoke to, and it's very important to know the audience. Where were the people's heads at in Greece, in Rome, in all these ancient connected cities? Where were they at in the culture? If we can get a good grip on where the culture was at, get a view, a bird's eye view of the culture, we can get an idea of what Paul was saying and who he was speaking to. Okay? We discovered that part of his audience were Epicureans. Now, the Epicureans, they were atheists, and they denied God existed, and they denied life after death. There were Stoics in the audience. There are also Stoics in the Bible and sages in the Bible. And that was a big part of the group that Paul was speaking to. And Stoics, they were followers of Zeno. They were pantheists, meaning they believed that everything is God. Everything. You know, these scissors, this pad, this comb, everything is God. And they did not believe that God was separate from creation. They did not believe that he was outside of his creation. Okay, which means that when you die, you don't have an individual identity when you die. You're just like a drop of water that goes back to one big pool of water and becomes one with the pool of water. He spoke to Jews and also the Greeks that were following Judaism at the time. They were opposed to the gods that were being worshipped in Greece, but they were helpless to prevent it because it was so huge. He spoke to common citizens. Now, the common citizens were these laborers. They were tradesmen. They were people that had crafts and vocations of many different kinds. And they were the unthinking victims of the idolatry that kept them in its grip, which means that they weren't even aware that they were trapped in superstition and idolatry. There were philosophers there. They were delivered. These philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Epicurus and all of that. They intellectually were delivered from the idolatry of the city, but what they offered was an alternative concept, which was pagan philosophy, which was barren and empty. So they weren't offering anything of any substance either. Then we went on to discuss women. Now, this is a very lengthy subject, the women, because it's all going to culminate into a very, very important message, people. You have to pay attention to this. We discussed women in Greece and in the ancient world, because Greece was next to all these other places, and they all treated women basically the same. Okay, we heard that women did not have a voice. Nobody listened to them. Nobody acknowledged them, anything they said. It was like crying in the wilderness. They were treated less than animals. They could not worship like the men worshipped. They weren't allowed to worship. And except the only time they were able to participate in anything religious was when they participated in the feasts and the festivals, and they were made to degrade themselves because they came out with little tunics or nothing at all, naked, and danced around for the audience with no clothes on. This was so humiliating. We discussed how women's anatomy was misunderstood by the public, and which led to abuse and misogyny everywhere. We talked about their reproductive system, which was misunderstood. They didn't understand how the reproductive system worked, and that led to suffering of these women. Most of them died giving birth, and misogyny. Though they had to bear a child, they also had to deal with the onslaught of an abusive, overpowering, and overbearing husband. We talked about women's menstruation, and it was considered disgusting and cursed, and they had to clean themselves out. I mean, nobody else has to clean their bodily fluids, and this is something very natural. And we see all the animals, and when children are born, they have this menstruation in their mouth and all over them, and it doesn't poison them or hurt them. And actually, this menstruation is where the seed latches onto in the womb, and that menstruation feeds them for the 9 months. So the men viewed this as disgusting, and that led to abuse and women feeling very, very lonely and unloved. We talked about a woman's role was that of a slave. And it was to serve the husband regardless of how he treated her. He could sell her into slavery. She was used just to bring forth children, and preferably a male child. And very often the husband sacrificed the female child to the gods. Just ripped the female baby out of the mother and away from the mother and sacrificed it to the god. And her children could be taken away from age 7. And we talked about that there were 30,000 gods in Greece. And above all these gods, there was one particular altar made to a god called the unknown god. And that is where we left off. But today, what we're going to talk about is the definition of something called hetaira, which is a euphemism for any kind of a prostitute. This position is supported by Konstantinos Keparis, who holds that Apollodorus' famous tripartite division of the types of women in speech against Neaera. Now, one particular type of hetaira was the Curtsians. Now, these are the categories that women in Greece fell into. All called prostitutes, like I said, was a euphemism for all the different classes of women. The courtesans specifically were for pleasure. So there were certain women that were used for pleasure. They were used for concubines and for daily tending of the body. And wives, in order to beget legitimate children and have trustworthy guardian of what is at home. In other words, there were some that were for pleasure. There were concubines for daily tending of the body. There were women that were wives in order to beget legitimate children and have a trustworthy guardian for those children. And all classes of prostitutes together fall under the term hetaira. All right? So that about sums up all of the classes of women in Greece. And now we're going to read about these classes of prostitutes and hetaira in ancient Athens. Men did not marry until they were 30 or so, and with such little opportunity to see, let alone chat with a respectable citizen woman outside of their immediate family. It is perhaps understandable that prostitution was an important part of their life, and the many men who came without families from various Greek colonies to seek employment in the prosperous city of Athens helped to make the sex trade a major industry. All right, so you think that the sex trafficking now is big? It was explosive back in the day because there were no laws protecting women at all. Athens helped to make sex trade a major industry. Major. That means that when you look at our culture today, what is a major industry today? Well, one major industry is pharmaceuticals, right? You see how big a pharmaceutical industry is? That's what they're saying. It was a major industry in Athens. We look and we see the energy industry, oil and fuel. That's huge, right? It's a major industry. That's what prostitution was back then. An often quoted maxim warned men not to squander their inheritances with too many visits to a brothel. But prostitution was legal and morally accepted. It was morally acceptable, and the concern was with the diminution of the estate, not with the way it was done. We have no way of knowing how many prostitutes lived in Athens, but the number is high enough that their stories make up a significant part of the real life of women in the ancient world, and any attempt to exclude them in favor of only the respectable married citizen would leave us with a very skewed picture of the life of women in ancient Greece. The ancients assumed that the victor in any battle had the right, if he so chose, to capture and enslave as many people as he could find in the conquered area. Imagine the shock experienced by a woman whose town or village is overrun and the survivors were swept up by slave traders who appeared to have arrived out of nowhere. Then imagine the horror she must have felt when she discovered that she was being auctioned off to a brothel. Depending on her age, depending on her looks, depending on her personality, her talent, and her luck, there were several different levels of prostitution in which she could find herself. At the bottom of the ladder were the streetwalkers who, for little or more than the price of 1 or 2 loaves of bread, serviced their clients in one of the alleys in the crowded downtown area. Some of these women wore shoes that pressed the words, "Follow me," into the hard-packed sand that served as pavement in parts of the city. Brothels varied considerably in quality, and some women got to entertain repeat customers and perhaps pick up tips in addition to the fee paid to the brothel owner. Building Z in the Karametikos section of Athens, located at the northwest of the Acropolis, was built and rebuilt several times, and in its third phase in the late 4th century BCE, probably served as a tavern and a brothel, and attested by the hundreds of drinking, eating vessels and many loom weights discovered inside. Spun wool was one of the items very high up on the urban dwellers' shopping list. Given the technology of the day, the spinning of wool was as mindless an enterprise as it was essential, and therefore it was ideal for slave labor. And because it could be easily put down and picked up again, it was a perfect task for those with frequent periods of freedom from some other job, like when they weren't in the corner serving some man sexually and they had a break, they can get and sit on the loom and start looming. And then when they needed to service a man, they could get off the loom and do it again. Brothel workers regularly spun between clients. We have no idea what their life was like, but 12, perhaps 15 rooms opened up off a rather large courtyard in Building Z. On average, each room contained 50 or 60 square feet. 3 interconnected cisterns brought rainwater to supplement a new well, and an open courtyard provided sun at least. Athenian writers made a distinction between pornai, appropriately translated as whore or harlot, who were slaves working in the streets and brothels, and the more upscale independent hetaira. The word hetaira is usually translated as courtesan, but its literal meaning is actually a female companion. And depending on the circumstances, she could function in roles we might call either a mistress or a hostess or a call girl. Few of the hetairai were slave, but most of them were either freedwomen, freeborn medics, or even the odd citizen who took the trade as their only means of support. Many were educated, but all were articulate, witty, and more than able to hold their own in a conversation with a group of men. In many ways, the hetairai was simply an independent businesswoman engaged to certain men for a fee. Some limited themselves to 2 or 3 wealthy clients, and others hired themselves out as the amusement as a men's gathering service one night as a musician or a dancer, and another night as a witty conversationalist, but most offered some combination of services whereby they welcomed a variety of men into their homes during the day and attended men's banquets at night. While not adverse to hard work itself, Athenian men took a very dim view of a long-term commitment to a single employer for a regular wage, the sort of thing we might call a job, likening it to slavery. To be truly free, it was necessary to own one's own business, and if that was not feasible, to contract out for a specific term and a specific project as a means of avoiding dependence on another man. Now, what this is saying is the men of Athens couldn't hold a job because in Greece, they perceived, as the Stoics did, that working for a man was entrapment. You were at the mercy of your employer. You were trapped. You couldn't do what you wanted. It was hell on earth. It was a prison to be dependent on that man to bring home the money to pay for your home. Okay? So they all very, very eagerly wanted to rise up into their own business or trade so they wouldn't be trapped with an employer. Now, Paul was in the business of tent making. I believe I discussed that in one of the first or second videos. He was very good at his trade, and he traveled from seaport to seaport to seaport all the time to handle his business and make money. Paul was wealthy from his trade. What some today refer to as the security of a long-term job was akin to slavery to Athenians, who preferred the freedom to move from one assignment to another without feeling tied to a single source of income. Could this be why Paul traveled from place to place and was missing for 2-3 years at a time, and we didn't know where he was? Could he have been promoting his trade of tent making? Could be. Just something to think about. Here is the real difference between pornai and hetairai. The former was slave and the latter were free and self-employed. Most modern societies regard sex work as immoral, if not illegal, but the Athenian denigrated the slave and accepted the self-employed hetairai profession as just as honorable as any other. Few hetairai were citizens, and none were virgins, so no man seeking legitimate citizen children would marry one. But otherwise, they seem to have been regarded as just as respectable as any other Medic woman. Now, remember when I talked about the woman at the well, and Jesus tried to offer her the living water, and I said to you that it was that he knew that she had 5 husbands before, because in this day and age, this was in Sumeria, and if she didn't make dinner right, or if she looked at him crooked, he could just say, get out. And she had no recourse. She had no income. She had no way to support herself. So she was hostage to this culture, this system. So Jesus had empathy for her. And Jesus was Jewish. She could have been menstruating, and if he believed in the Levitical laws and the written oral Talmud laws, then he wouldn't have spoke to her, would he? but he engaged in conversation with her. He didn't treat her like she was a filthy rag. He wanted to help her to get out of the trap that these men put the women in.
Give me to drink.
How is it that thou, a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? The Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans.
If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water.
Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with. The well is deep. From whence then hast thou this living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle?
Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. The water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life.
Sir, give me of this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw.
Go, call thy husband, and come hither.
I have no husband.
Thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands.
Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. And ye say that it is in Jerusalem that men ought to worship.
Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain, nor yet at Jerusalem, worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, and salvation is of the Jews. And the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. For unto such hath God promised his Spirit, and they who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth.
I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. And when he is come, he will tell us all things.
I that speak unto thee am he.
A few of hetairai may well have been literate, but none troubled to keep a diary or provide a description of their life. And thinking, so we are left again with the picture provided by men who are, of course, writing about themselves, and just happen to throw in a few tidbits about the women who crossed their paths. With no professional sports or television to watch and no movie theaters to visit, men relied on get-togethers with friends for their entertainment. They would gather at one another's homes to share a meal, a drink, and conversation with the relative importance of these ingredients varying according to the education and social class of the guests. The Greek banquet was never the extravagant, prolific affair the Roman could have been on occasion, and wives were never invited to them. Respectable citizen women were not allowed to attend. There might have been hetairai, elutrides, and of course slave girls to serve the food and clear away the dishes. The Greek word elutride is conventionally translated as flute girl, but the instrument in question was a double reed that sounded much more like an oboe than a flute. Alternatively, some girls played the harp and some were dancers or gymnasts. Interestingly, Athens established a maximum price of 2 drachmas that could be paid to such girls for an evening's entertainment. This is a little bit more than a male laborer would have made for a whole day's toil, but certainly not enough to make up for their rather short working life. It is not known how often that law was flouted, but it is likely that sexual services warranted an extra fee. And Athenius tells us that it was customary for them to be auctioned off to the highest bidder at the end of the evening. The symposium itself was not an orgy. If there was sex, it took place in an anteroom away from the rest of the guests. Hetairai and elutrides were there for comic relief, but they were not the reason for the gathering. We have only 2 complete accounts of a symposium, which is not enough on which to draw any real conclusions, and at one event, the flute girl was sent away as soon as she arrived, so that nothing could interfere with serious discussions. While relating in detail the conversation on another occasion, Xenophon inserted a description on the floor show provided by the host for the evening's entertainment. A Syracusan brought 3 young people into the room. The flute girl performed first, followed by a dancer. When the latter's opening routine was finished, she was given 12 large hoops, which she proceeded to juggle as she resumed dancing. For the final item on this part of the program, a large ring holding upright a number of sharply pointed swords was laid on the floor. The dancer then performed a dazzling series of front and back somersaults into and out of the ring. The men were understandably more than a little impressed. Socrates, one of the guests, remarked that this proved that, quotes, and this is Socrates, except in matters of physical strength and judgment, women's nature is in no way inferior to man because they could do these things. After serving of drinks and further conversation, 2 of the performers returned to act out a meeting of Ariadne and Dionysus, which finished with the 2 women fondling and kissing each other and swearing their mutual love. At that point, the guests declared the evening a great success and headed home with no indication whatever of sexual activity between the guests and the performers. Now, I just want to bring you briefly to a scripture in Acts. This is in chapter 17, the last verse, verse 34. It says, "Howbeit, certain men clave unto him, and believed, among the which was Dionysus, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." Now, didn't I just say her name when she performed at the end, kissing another woman in front of this gathering of men? Here she is in scripture in Acts. She's mentioned in Acts chapter 17, verse 34, if you want to go and read it. A number of ancient writers recorded the witty sayings of hetairai and described incidents of their lives. Best known of these is Athenius, an Egyptian writing in early 3rd century Rome, who in the 13th chapter of the De Phone Sophist, or Dinner Sophists, told, along with his own sarcastic editorial comment stories that had been passed down to him from the symposium that had taken place years earlier. One courtesan, which is one of the levels of prostitutes, who got several mentions, was the late 4th century BCE hetairai, Nathanian. As an example of her quick wit, Athenius quotes her one night at a symposium, watching another courtesan gather up food to take to her mother. "If I had known you were going to do this, I would have had dinner with your mother instead of coming here." Another courtesan, Neaera, when accused by a teacher of corrupting youth, replied, "It makes no difference whether youth is corrupted by a philosopher or a courtesan." Complimented on the coolness of the wine she was serving a playwright, another replied, quotes, "I just put in one of your prologues," unquote. The fact that she could get away with such a blatant insult of a guest is a sign of her self-confidence and the high standing in which she was held by the men at the party. She was being paid for her presence, but she was more than an ordinary worker. In an age in society where respectable women were entirely dependent on the men in their life, a talented hetairai was able to live on her own terms and accumulate enough money to live in style and comfort. Nathanian was said to have been traveling cheaply when she went on the occasion of a religious festival to the Piraeus to meet a foreign merchant who was her lover. She went on a litter with 3 donkeys, 3 maidservants, and one young nurse in her train. When the courtesan Pyrene demanded a full mina for her services, a potential customer objected, saying that she had recently accepted just 2 gold coins from someone else. She retorted, quotes, "If you wish, you can wait to see if the day will come when I feel like indulging myself again," unquote. In the Hellenistic era, a Macedonian named Harpalus became quite besotted with an Athenian courtesan named Pythonese and spent a great deal of money on her. When she died, he built a very expensive monument in her honor and then hired a large choir of distinguished artists to accompany her corpse in a parade through the streets. With no diaries or other record revealing details of her daily life from an insider's point of view, we have not the slightest idea what any hetairai thought of her profession, but we do know that a few, at least, acquired all the trappings of a successful, comfortable life. Women who made their living by appealing to men knew that they would have a short career. Youth and beauty would all too quickly fade, and even once loyal customers would take their trade elsewhere. To provide for their retirement, many of the free prostitutes bought slave girls or retrieved abandoned female infants to raise and train to carry on the business. Sometimes a slave prostitute was able to make such an impression on one man that he would buy her and set her up as his concubine. The Dialogues of Courtesans by Lucian is a collection of vignettes about Athenian hetairais, written in Greek by a 2nd century itinerant lecturer. A courtesan has to make a living, but she is just as susceptible to Cupid's arrow as any other woman. It is to be expected that money will play an important part of any story dealing with hetairai. But if you overlook the commercial side of these tales, many of the themes will ring just as true today as they did 2,000 years ago. In one story, a young hetairai had fallen in love with one of her clients. Unfortunately, the object of her affection is the least generous of her clients. Quotes, "You turn down an offer of 200 drachmas from a farmer to spend time with a boyfriend who won't even give you a pair of earrings," complained the mother. "But Mom," exclaimed the daughter, "he smells like a goat." Anyway, love is more important than money. Many women since then, perhaps even a few today, have no doubt found themselves in the position of having to choose between the one most loved and the one best able to provide a comfortable lifestyle. A friend tells of a witch who will reignite his love at a cost of only a single drachma. "Bring some salt, sulfur wine, 7 coins, and some of the man's clothing," she said, "and the witch will drink the wine, burn the sulfur under the clothes, and recite the secret charm." When young Corina's father, a blacksmith, died, her mother managed to support herself and daughter by a little weaving and by selling his forge. But each year there was less and less money, and the mother knew that her daughter would have to become a hetairai if they were even to get by. Corina had just earned her first 100 drachmas, and in the rest of the story, the mother tells her daughter how to be a success. Dress elegantly and be amiable. Don't giggle. Don't stuff yourself or get drunk at a party. Keep your eyes only on the one who has paid you. When Corina asked if she would ever have to date homely men, the mother said yes, because they pay better. Those are the ones that smell like goats. Oh, Lord. In one, a mother tries to tell her 18-year-old daughter who believes that she has just found true love that she will have to become a hetairai and spread her love around among many men if they are to have enough money to live on. The historical record is full of biographical material on royals and military leaders. But very once in a while, the life story of a commoner pops up. One such example is a courtesan Neaera, whose story is recounted in one of a collection of speeches recorded in Athens by Demosthenes. The transcript is unofficial and includes only the speech by the prosecutor, Apollodorus, who sued his political opponent, Stephanus, for falsely passing off his daughter as a citizen when her mother was a foreign-born prostitute. While the story is sufficiently detailed to form the skeleton of a full novel, I have included only the shorts of the incident that may have happened to any number of other women in the Greek world. Neaera was one of 7 slave girls purchased as children by the madam of a high-end brothel in Corinth. Neaera had a number of famous and wealthy customers, 2 of whom have grown tired of making regular payments to the madam, arranged to buy her outright for 30 minas, about what a laborer could expect to earn in 8 years. When it came time for them to marry, the 2 men offered to allow Neaera to buy her freedom for 20 minas. Although the men argued they were rewarding her by accepting less than they paid, the discount more likely reflected the maximum they were going to get on the open market, since she was now several years older. Part of the deal included Neaera's promise to leave Corinth. An Athenian named Phrynon put up a large part of this sum. She went with him to Athens, expecting, if not marriage, at least respectable concubinage, but ended up working for him as a cheap prostitute. She left him taking 2 servants and other goods and ran away to Megara, where she tried to ply her trade for 2 years. She met Stephanus, who offered to take her back to Athens and negotiate an agreement with Phrynon, whereby they would employ an arbiter to decide on a fair compensation for the latter's loss when Neaera ran away. She and Stephanus lived together, presumably in mutual happiness, until she was into her 70s, and Apollodorus launched his suit. There can be no doubt that Neaera, as charged, had been a prostitute for many years and was never an Athenian citizen, but the crux of the matter centered on the percentage of children. If Stephanus fathered the children by another wife, their citizenship would be assured. But if convicted, Stephanus would have lost not only his political rights and citizenship, but any land he owned as well, since, as we have seen, non-citizens could not own real property in Athens. We have no idea how the story ended, but perhaps that spoils some of the fun, but the tale reveals a lot about life in ancient Athens. People's very sorry life for women in Paul's day. And one thing I want you to contemplate as we live the life that these women lived by reading about them. This possibly was the reason that infiltrated Paul's writing that kept women from speaking in the church. Since they had no identity, they had no voice. They had no rights. They had to stay in their houses. They were subjugated to men that were very unkind to them and exploited their labor, their bodies, their human rights. And this, I believe, is at the bottom of Paul's scripture of women not speaking in the church and righteousness considered filthy rags. I want you to think about that as we go forward, because I'm going to come out with more. But this is a very, very important thing that you need to think about. Okay? I want to bless you in Jesus' holy name. Okay? And remind you that this video will be in the playlist, Unraveling the Apostle Paul. God bless everyone.